Hi, I'm Dongxiang. Welcome to Digging into China, where we explore China in depth to review unique perspectives. The current state of Chinese economy is quite troubled, and life for the general population is very difficult. I trust this goes without saying. However, to claim that the Chinese economy is utterly finished would also be inaccurate. The economy is currently clinging to life. It appears to be in a near-collapse state. If one argues it's in a complete meltdown, the stock market and the GDP growth have recently shown reasonable performance. Yet, if one claims it hasn't broken, the recent signs are clear. Declining consumption, soaring youth unemployment, a collapsing birth rate, and the widespread emergence of lying flat rhetoric. Many people are experiencing the worst economic conditions of their lives, a reality deeply felt by the Chinese populace. Present-day China resembles a dying patient in an intensive care unit ICU, sustained only by oxygen. So, why is China's economy perpetually stuck in this near-collapse condition? Does this state pose a risk of a sudden total collapse? If so, what signal would indicate that? This video will explain the near-collapse Chinese economy. Before we address these issues, we must first explain why the Chinese economy seems to be in a near-collapse state. Where does this feeling come from? The core of the matter traces back to the pull of China's trade surplus on the overall GDP, specifically the net export effect, which is the value remaining after imports are subtracted from exports. We frequently hear the concept that China built its nation through exports. However, since 2010, exports haven't been in the sole engine of China's economic advancement, at least not in terms of net exports. In fact, net exports have sometimes had a negative impact on GDP growth. China constantly emphasizes GDP growth figures, 5% this year, 6% last year. How exactly is this percentage of GDP growth calculated? It is the sum of three components: consumption, investment, and net exports. Of course, not all three are always positive. In the 9 years from 2010 to 2018, the average pull of net exports on GDP was negative 0.27. It actually acted as a drag, largely because the share of exports in China's overall GDP was steadily decreasing. This trend, however, began to shift in 2019. Post-2019, China entered a phase of frenetic activity. Despite the pandemic restricting China's interaction with the world, the pull of net exports on GDP saw a significant increase. In 2021, net exports contributed 1.7 percentage point to GDP, and in 2024, it was 1.5 percentage point. For 2025, based on data released by the Bureau of Statistics, for the first half of the year, net exports contributed 1.65% to GDP. During the years I've mentioned, net exports have been responsible for over 30% of GDP growth. While China is not overly reliant on exports overall, exports account for only 18% of GDP, far less than South Korea's 40% or Taiwan's 65%. The nation's GDP growth in the last 2 years has been entirely dependent on net exports. In fact, one could argue that the entire current Chinese economy is being held up by net exports. To better illustrate the magnitude of net exports' influence and the supporting role on China's current economic growth, let's consider a comparative scenario. If China hadn't aggressively pursued exports over the past 2 years, maintaining a consistent level with the 2010 to 2018 period, where the annual impact of net exports on GDP was about negative 0.3%, the 2024 GDP growth rate wouldn't be 5%, 3.5% plus 1.5% from net exports. It would instead be 3.5% plus the standard negative 0.3% from net exports, resulting in 3.2%. This is the GDP growth China should have without the boost from foreign trade. What is the true significance of this 3.2% GDP growth rate? Let's compare it not to India or Vietnam, which are at different developmental stages, but to other middle-income countries. The global average GDP growth for middle-income countries in 2024 is 4.4%, which is notably higher than 3.2%. Among familiar middle-income countries, Malaysia's growth rate is 5.1%, and China's neighbor Kazakhstan grew by 4.8% in 2024. Even Russia, amidst wartime, grew by 4.3% in 2024. Taiwan, an already developed economy, also grew by 4.3% in 2024. A GDP growth rate of around 3.2% would be acceptable, even decent, for a developed country. But for a developing nation like China, it is a disaster. An economic collapse is not strictly defined by a negative GDP growth rate. For a developing country such as China, a slowdown to 3.2% growth already constitutes a catastrophe. Furthermore, the calculation is likely an oversimplification, as a collapse in exports would undoubtedly impact both investment and consumption. Without the support of foreign trade, China's GDP growth over the last 2 years might have been only 2%, which would be an unmitigated economic disaster. This disaster has been averted, with China artificially elevating its GDP to 5% through net exports. What is the cost of this achievement? It is directly evident in the reduction of export prices. China's surge in exports did not materialize out of thin air. It was achieved by slashing prices. Since April 2023, China's export price index has been stuck in negative territory and has not yet recovered, showing negative growth month after month. This signifies a continuous drop in the prices of Chinese exported products. Consequently, the spike in China's net exports has been secured by sacrificing price for market share. Did this sudden drop in China's export prices result from some rapid technological breakthrough leading to a massive boost in Chinese production efficiency? Did the cost of manufacturing a car drop from $10,000 to $5,000? While Chinese technology has surely advanced, there hasn't been a sudden dramatic leap. This sudden drastic price reduction is actually a product of further internal competition or involution among the Chinese people. For instance, look at the average weekly working hours of the Chinese populace. Also starting in April 2023, the average working hours reached an inflection point and suddenly surged, jumping from an average of 47.9 hours per week to 48.8 hours, and subsequently climbing to 49 hours. The working hours of the Chinese workforce saw an immediate qualitative leap. Of course, we cannot place all the blame on company owners. These demanding bosses are often acting out of necessity, as corporate profits in China have simultaneously crashed during this period. The increase in working hours is a continuation of falling corporate profits, a desperate measure taken by companies facing meager margins after cutting prices, forcing them to further squeeze employees to absorb losses. This brings us to the explanation for why the Chinese economy is in this near-collapse state. Based on hard economic data, has the Chinese economy collapsed? No, not technically. A 5% GDP growth rate, while not stellar, is enough to keep China from falling behind its developing nation peers. However, this 5% GDP growth is not organic. It's achieved through a nationwide effort to produce at low prices. It is bought at the expense of Chinese workers' excessive hours, chronic overtime, and wage cuts. It's achieved through Chinese bosses producing at a loss, leading to more overtime, salary reductions, and lower business profits. In reality, this is already the outcome of an underlying economic collapse. These two paradoxical states combine to form China's current near-collapse situation. In real-world terms, you can envision China as a store or superstore surviving by relying on clearance sales. Has the sales volume, which is GDP, increased because of this on-sale promotion? Yes, it has, because GDP stands for gross domestic product, measuring production, not profitability. Under these conditions, the Chinese mall is just managing to stay open, maintaining a seemingly prosperous, respectable exterior. But is the business actually making money beneath its facade? No, it is not, because the products are all being dumped at the low prices, and because the dumping requires round-the-clock work, the employees are also exhausted. When will China exit this near-collapse state? In other words, when might we see a true collapse? What will be the inflection point that turns near collapse into total collapse? I believe the test is twofold: the tolerance threshold of foreign buyers and the endurance limit of the Chinese people themselves. Let's start with the tolerance of foreigners. Chinese workers are sacrificing themselves, working 996 to produce goods, and the bosses are selling products to foreigners even at a loss. On the surface, foreigners are the direct beneficiary, much like when you buy a deeply discounted item at a store. If the seller is losing money, the buyer directly benefits. But international trade is not just a game between buyers and sellers. While China's cheap products benefit overseas consumers, the accompanying Chinese impact is destroying the manufacturing sectors in those countries. This leads to China's first problem: retaliation from other nations. China's current low-price dumping is crushing local manufacturing in these countries, preventing their own people from producing normally. Since they don't want to engage in a grueling price war, what is their recourse? They can only erect trade barriers, imposing tariffs to mitigate the damage. Trump's recent rallying cry to bring manufacturing back to the US speaks directly to this concept. Of course, after the US closed its doors, China didn't give up. It couldn't, or the economy's true state would be exposed. So, China began dumping its products towards countries in Africa, Latin America, and India. After the US-China trade war formally began, China's trade volumes with the rest of the world started to surge. Trump essentially forced the problem of China's dumping onto the entire world. If the US lacked the tolerance for China's product dumping, do these other countries have it? Not really. In fact, the US likely has the highest tolerance for Chinese dumping in the world, given its better economic fundamentals. Consequently, these other countries have recently begun showing some soft resistance toward China. For example, the trade complaints and anti-dumping investigations against China since 2024 have reached a historical peak, and many of these investigations are initiated by third world countries. If these nations become resolute and form an anti-China dumping alliances, collectively imposing tariffs on China, then no matter how cheap China's products are or how much more the Chinese people involute, the products may become unsaleable. This would easily lead to an export collapse, which would in turn trigger a major economic collapse. However, I believe this probability is not very high, primarily for practical reasons. Currently, in the face of China's dumping, only giants like the EU and the US can effectively push back. Most other countries dare to be angry but not speak out. The only third world country that truly dares to stand up to China is Mexico. Others are simply observing, a decision made out of necessity. While many countries recognize the danger of China's dumping, since Trump has already launched the American version of the trade war and is aggressively engaging globally, many nations, even those with current grievances against China, are hesitant to fight a trade war with China simultaneously. The cost of provoking the world's two major trade powers at once is simply too high, essentially eliminating their room to maneuver. Most countries are currently choosing to exercise restraint. Therefore, while the formation of an anti-China dumping alliance would inflict devastating damage on the Chinese economy and trigger a collapse, I believe that in reality such an anti-China trade coalition is likely to emerge among developed countries like Europe, the US, Japan, and South Korea, but not among third world nations. Of course, the inability of third world countries to form this anti-dumping alliance does not mean China can remain perpetually in a near-collapse state. China cannot simply rely on dumping to third world countries indefinitely to maintain its current economic status. The main reason is the limited purchasing power of third world countries. Xi Jinping has frequently promoted the narrative of the Belt and Road initiatives and the grand unity of third world countries. But this narrative is inherently unpromising. There is a major logical flaw. These brother nations of China severely lack purchasing power. The only countries in the world truly capable of consuming such a massive volume of Chinese products are Europe, the US, Japan, and South Korea. This underlying logic has persisted since the push for internal circulation began. Why is internal circulation failing? Why can't the Chinese people consume their own products and even consume the world's products like Americans do? This is not due to any dollar hegemony of the US. It is purely because the Chinese people's consumption capacity is inadequate. The consumption capacity of the Chinese people has been completely exploited by the CCP. Without the money or the ability to consume, the only recourse is to let people in less exploited nations such as developed countries consume their products. The Chinese workforce creates goods, which are then sold to ordinary Westerners, generating income from them. This money then flows into the hands of the CCP elites, who then go to the West to enjoy their wealth. If ordinary foreign consumers were removed from this equation, the entire logic would break down. This is why internal circulation is failing. The logic of internal circulation is essentially that the Chinese workforce creates products, but the Chinese workforce's consumption capacity is insufficient. They can only consume a small portion, and the rest goes to the elite. However, the elite's consumption of products is finite. They don't need that many goods. After all, one person, no matter how energetic, cannot simultaneously drive 100 sports cars. They need ordinary Westerners to absorb the surplus products produced by the Chinese workforce, converting them into cash that is delivered to the elites. So, what are the Belt and the Road Initiative and the Great China-Africa Friendship? They are essentially attempts to replace the ordinary Western consumers with the large African and Latin American workforce. But there is a fundamental flaw here. These African nations, Xi Jinping's good brothers, are one more dictatorial and more exploitative than the next. Under these circumstances, these large African and Latin American workforces actually have very little purchasing power and not much money in their pockets. Pursuing this strategy is arguably less effective than pursuing internal circulation. For instance, with the current price cut dumping, such as BYD electric vehicles entering these markets, people might purchase them initially out of novelty and low cost. However, their consumer capacity is quickly drained. Moreover, the low price dumping is actively destroying these countries' own economies and manufacturing, making their future purchasing power even more dubious. It is unrealistic to expect these African big brothers who struggle to feed themselves to consume your photovoltaic solar panels or your electric vehicles. These countries won't form an anti-China dumping alliance, but there will be a moment when their economic value is completely exhausted. The moment the last bit of value from the African and the Latin American brothers is squeezed dry by Xi Jinping and they can no longer absorb China's dumped products, will be the moment China's foreign trade exports abruptly collapse, which will also be the moment the Chinese economy completely breaks. However, the limit of this endurance is not solely dependent on foreigners. It also relies on the Chinese people's own tolerance. With the current conditions of Chinese life, with average weekly work hours reaching 49 hours, which is effectively 6 days of 8-hour work, how much longer can the Chinese people themselves endure? This, too, is a critical question. The recent surge in the lying flat phenomenon online is a clear sign of this growing sentiment. Many Chinese people are currently enduring 996, not necessarily out of fear of starvation, but primarily out of concern that a lack of effort will lead to a drop in social class, an inability to pay mortgages, and becoming a loan defaulter. But should a day come when the Chinese people can no longer bear it, become completely exhausted from the constant competition, and enter a phase of collective resignation, unwilling to compete, then this near-collapse situation in China will begin to transition into a total collapse. Naturally, this is also one reason why the CCP has been aggressively cracking down on lying flat on the internet. Lying flat is directly undermining the foundation of China's current economy. But as for how much longer the Chinese people can endure, I believe this period of endurance won't last much longer. After all, many Chinese people have now started to abandon even the fundamental desire to have children. How much further away is the moment they let go of all other obligations? The Chinese populace is poised to re-enter a phase of alternating involution and the lying flat, though the nature of these terms is different each time. In the 2015 era, where the Chinese people first entered the age of involution, it was a completely different concept from the current one. That was a golden age, especially for the internet, offering young people abundant opportunities. Competition was fierce due to the high number of young people, but those who were willing and able to compete could still achieve significant rewards and even the possibility of social class ascension. At that time, people were involutionary competitors who were both suffering and thriving. However, starting in 2019, with the economic downturn, the returns on involution rapidly declined, and the competition yielded little rewards. This led to the first rise of the anti-involution lying flat culture. Yet, compared to today, the young people then were primarily lamenting the lack of return on their efforts and the necessity of lying flat. Today, that opportunity to lie flat is becoming scarce. With the deepening economic contraction, the Chinese people have entered an era where there is no escape from the pressure to compete, forcing them back into involution. When you try to lie flat now, you find countless obstacles preventing you, such as the decline in parents' income, which removes financial support for those who want to rely on family, or the threat of immense mortgage debt, sudden salary cuts, and the risk of unexpected corporate layoffs. I predict that China will soon enter the lying flat era once more. The current period of intense involution is drawing to a close. However, this second phase of lying flat will be different from the last. The previous phase was a voluntary withdrawal because effort felt unrewarding. This new phase may be an involuntary resignation accompanied by the collapse of exports, trade barriers, and the reduced consumer spending in Latin America and Africa, a time when bosses can't find buyers for their products, and there are no positions available even for those who want to compete. Work 996 and put in overtime. Alternatively, it may be a complete surrender. Many people simply giving up the fight, accepting the fate of mortgage defaults, and accepting a drop in social class, resulting in a resigned state of lying flat. Regardless of its form, the second wave of this lying flat culture is both a symptom of true decline and a widespread fate for the Chinese people in this period. The tragedy of this era. Thank you so much for watching. If you find this video helpful, please like it, drop a comment below, and hit the subscribe button right here. It really helps YouTube suggest my video to others. I'll be back with more content soon. Until then, be well.